Thanks, Elnas. Okay, very nice words. Actually, I thought it was going to be very short little introduction, and then Elnas said, no, you have to talk a little bit more. So I've got a very short few points I'd like to make, and then I'll hand over to the real speakers today and introduce them. But I'll just make a few welcome and comments. Let me first try to get a PowerPoint up. There we go. Perfect. And that's all good. Yep. So what I thought, we've been talking about food security this morning. So I thought, okay, I won't talk any more about food security and sustainability and so on. That's extremely important and one of the kernels of our activities here at ITC in the Department of Natural Resources with dear colleagues in the Natural Resources Department. But we're actually, if you look at it in a geological sense, many people think we're now into what has been termed the Anthropocene, the period when humans are altering the landscape. So the question is there such a thing as an Anthropocene, and are we in it? Right? Interesting. It's an interesting idea that actually that humans are impacting the Earth's surface to such an extent that there'll be a global signal left in the permanent geological record. So is that really happening? You know, we're saying, yes, it's definitely happening, but when you start to think about it, it's actually quite difficult to nail down what are humans doing at the moment that would be permanently recorded using techniques we currently know for looking at these geological epochs. So, you know, some of it's very obvious. We sculpture the Earth. We create mines and mine sites, and these are big holes in the ground which will be there in millions of years' time, or at least the evidence of those holes in the ground will be there. And there's 60,000 abandoned mines in Australia, large mines, and nearly 600,000 abandoned mines in the US. From these mines, we're now moving around. More sedimentary material are being moved by humans every year than are being moved by all natural erosional processes combined. So, in a way, we're accelerating the movement of materials. Does this actually leave a trace? We don't know. There's any area you look at, water resources, similar story, that the Anthropocene has distorted the river's natural flows with diversions and storages. And if you look at the great water catchments of the world, you see that there's a few even that are 100% of their runoff is stored. The Nile, for instance, and a number of the dam systems in the western US. And a number of others are well, more than 100% of the runoff is stored. Others have got, you know, right up there, 50 to 100% of the runoff is being stored. So massive changes in the hydrology of the Earth. Is this having an impact on the Anthropocene? Will we be seeing this signal in millions of years' time? Third example I just pick out, pollution. Pollution is everywhere. We're very concerned at the moment about plastic pollution and impacts of plastic pollution, say in the marine environment, but also on Earth. This idea that macroplastic breaks down to microplastic, breaks down to nanoplastic, bits of plastic everywhere. Some beaches around the world are now 50% plastic, comprised of bits of nanoplastic. And now, if they're looking at the umbilical cords of newborn babies globally, basically every baby is having nanoplastics detected in its umbilical cord. So these nanoplastics are just everywhere. We don't know if it's benign or not, but this pollution is, and that's just one area of pollution. You could talk about heavy metals, we could talk about these organic and inorganic compounds, carcinogenic compounds, that do not break down, the PNAS, and so on. Now, of course, my great hobby, and a lot of my dear colleagues in the department's great hobby, is ecosystems. And this will be more the topic that the two keynote experts coming up will be talking to. But I just wanted to put a little bit of commentary here about how these global ecosystems have been altered in the Anthropocene by humans, and how have we impacted on the Earth's ecosystems, and are we creating a global record? Are we creating a permanent record globally in the geological time, that someone in millions of years' time, scientists could look back and say, oh, those guys really were doing something all those millions of years ago? Well, we're changing the world in absolutely sweeping ways. It's absolutely mind-blowing how much of the Earth's surface has been converted from natural into semi-natural and then into fully human-altered landscapes. And it's all around production of biomass and production of agriculture. And there's many great studies are showing this. And it's clearly the impacts of humans are quite dramatic. You can see a few graphs there of production of biomass. Wilderness areas are very little, and generally the remaining wilderness areas are there for a reason, that they're very, very difficult and challenging for people to actually farm, mine, get into traditionally. But they're being chipped away. Slowly, these last great wilderness areas of the world. If you look at agriculture, change in soil organic carbon, and most importantly, and the sort of area that we've been working on for the last few years, and what the keynote speakers will be talking about, is biodiversity. Loss of biodiversity and species richness as a result of land cover and land use change. And the whole Earth is being changed through this. There's species loss and loss of species richness globally, apart from a few of these remaining perhaps wilderness areas which are pretty intact and still rather preserved. The other big story, of course, and that'll be starting I think on Sunday in Glasgow, the COP 26 or 27, discussing climate change and whether humans will actually be taking any action on this. And if they are taking action, is it real action, or is it a lot of blah, blah, blah from politicians and businesses and so on claiming they take action? Because if you look at the evidence, you look at the temperature anomalies, and you look at the CO2 emissions, CO2 now is the annual emission is way above anything it was before the pandemic. Interestingly, there was a little dip in the pandemic when everything stopped that was recorded, and now it's already zooming ahead. We're back to it, even without all the international flying and tourism and everything else. Just, it's the industrial processes that are going on in the world. How does this impact on the diversity of life, and how does biodiversity and climate interact? Very little research and very little activity has been done on this. So finally, I'd just like to sort of introduce really the topics, the monitoring of the biodiversity, and this will be something that Dr. Thomas Gruen will be talking about, and discussing methods for monitoring biodiversity. We'll be discussing biodiversity from the perspective of landscapes and ecosystems, from the perspective of individual species. That's what we normally think about with biodiversity. How many species do we have, and how many individuals or populations of those species? And then finally, the genetics. The third great area of biodiversity, the third great area of rapid research going on at the moment, rapid development, where we look not at actual species, but we look at the genetics behind that that's driving everything. And looking at the variety and what actually, it starts the question, what actually is a species? We know there's a lot of loss going on, and I'm sure from a policy perspective, Dr. Ilse Reisendorfer will be discussing this in some detail with the policy. Just to whet your appetite, the IPBES report in 2019, there's over 1 million species are threatened globally, have been identified in this species, and 3/4 of the land and 2/3 of the marine environment has been significantly altered by humans. So is this an Anthropocene or not? Are we going to see this in the permanent record or not? The permanent geological record. Just to do a little plug, we recently started a new project about a year ago at ITC called Biospace. And this is a project where we're monitoring biodiversity using genetic composition measured with environmental DNA and remote sensing. It's quite exciting, and yeah, we're just getting started with that with a number of colleagues, and so far very promising and interesting results. The basic idea is that we can look at the genetic record, genetics of organisms, and we're able to see that there are certain functions associated with particular species or groups of species, and we can see the same functions in remote sensing. So in this figure on the left is a figure mapped with satellite showing leaf and canopy nitrogen content in the savannas of South Africa. And this was mapped with the red edge band of rapid eye satellite at about 6-meter resolution. On the right you see, say, a typical nitrogen cycle in bacteria. Now we know that components of this nitrogen cycle on the right, components of that are very linked to particular parts of the genetic record in species and in groups of species, in families and in different orders of taxonomic orders. So what we're doing is we're trying to link information in the remote sensing that we can see through, say, spectroscopy. We're mapping things like leaf nitrogen and link that through to the genetics. Then we can map the distribution of these species that we can't see actually, things like the microbiome, things like fungi and so on. So that's the idea behind this, this project. What are the practical applications? Just to finish up, linking biodiversity DNA to, say, deadwood dieback in Bavaria Forest National Park. So right across Europe, spruce trees are dying on a massive scale. What's the link here? What's the signal that we can detect with environmental DNA and link that back to deadwood in Bavaria Forest? We have very strong reasons to believe this is a direct link. And this is some of the work that's going on in this Biospace project. So finally, my final comment is, before I finally introduce the speakers, what about perceptions of the Anthropocene? What are our perceptions here? We tend to look at climate change, and we all, and not all, well, I think exclusively, pardon me, exclusively look at climate change, and mostly or almost exclusively look at biodiversity. as, sorry about this, it fell off. There we go. And more or less exclusively look at biodiversity studies in terms of our perception as humans. And I just thought it was really interesting to turn this round. How would it be in Glasgow if representatives of different species were sentient and they could turn up and they could give a perception, of course, theoretical, right, hypothetical? Would that change our view of the world? If we could have different species turn up and give a view of how they're experiencing the Anthropocene. How are they experiencing human activity? And of course, if we're destroying their homes, essentially, their habitat, we call it in ecology, right? How would these species and individuals, how would they be experiencing that? Indeed, what is their perception, and can they survive in the Anthropocene? That's the big question. So it's kind of interesting, I think, that we're all very blinkered. We look at these problems from a certain perspective, normally exclusively human-orientated. Wouldn't it be interesting if we started to look at this from slightly different perspectives? It even could be other people's perspectives, to talk, to understand, to try to negotiate to a good position where everyone agrees we should be. And wouldn't it be even more interesting if there were other species that could communicate in some way, and they could tell us how they're experiencing things? I'm sure that would very dramatically change our policy and our viewpoints of biodiversity.